It's This Week in Creationism, episode number 43. I'm your host, Joel Duff, and here we take a look at some of the recent headlines in the world of creationism. This week, we're just going to talk about one headline. Ken Ham calls out the enemy within. It's the big news in creationism from the past 2 weeks. And I'm only going to be scratching the surface today. I'm sure that we're going to talk about this quite a bit in the future, because apparently this is the beginning of a series of articles in which Ken Ham, or really Answers in Genesis as an organization, is calling out perceived enemies within the midst of creationism, right? Ones inside the fort, inside their own home, they're calling out as being a danger to themselves. What's that all about? Is this really as serious as it sounds? What are my impressions of this particular event? How significant is it in the history of creationism, which is full of splits and divisions and interesting twists and turns between organizations? Where does this one rank in that? So let's talk about Ken Ham calling out the enemy within, or alternative names would have been Ken Ham cannibalizes creationism, or Ken Ham's war with creationists. All right, it's a little dramatic, but the way this article that we're going to read reads very dramatically. I honestly don't think it's that big of a deal, but let's get into that coming up. What we have in store for you today is a story of anonymous authorship, of calling out individuals that are well-known individuals within young earth creationists for being doctrinally wrong, for being evolutionists, all right, for placating secular science. These are serious, very serious claims, at least serious claims within the world of creationism. What's this all about? What's really going on here? Before we get into that, let's back up and just look at, Joel, what are you talking about? What happened? A particular article came out 2 weeks ago. So here we have Ken Ham on the 27th, a couple days after the release of the first article. Let's just read his tweet here to give just a little flavor for what he's introducing, what he's promoting to his audience. And in quotes here. So this is a quote from the article that we're going to look at. Think for a moment about an important biblical doctrine that you're very passionate about. Ken Ham's passionate about a lot of biblical doctrines. Now imagine that someone has come into your church and fundamentally changed the interpretation of that doctrine. This sounds really serious. They tell you they believe the same doctrine you do, but they are constantly agree with theologians on the other side of the debate. All right, so they tell you they believe the same doctrines you do. In other words, he's going to say these are sheep in wolves' clothing. Wait a second, that's not right. These are wolves in sheep's clothing. But if you look a little closer, they constantly agree with theologians on the other side of the debate, with some of those theologians even being openly apostate. So these individuals that are creationists, which he hasn't said yet, these are young earth creationists, are agreeing with apostate theologians. They also bring those interpretations into your youth groups. Watch out. They're coming after your youth. They're going for the young people. And this is exactly what Ken Ham's strategy is, right? You begin with the youth and you indoctrinate them in the correct beliefs, and they will go on to believe in their old age the things they've been taught when they're young. So he recognizes that he knows that this is a powerful tool for maintaining a particular set of beliefs, and they're using that same tool. They also bring their Sunday schools and maybe even your church school. So not only in church, but in your youth group, in your Sunday school classes, and even in your Christian schools. Many of them are openly praised by the same theologians who oppose your views. Your views? In other words, my views that are your views. These folks are being praised by some individuals. Some of these theologians in these cemeteries, right? These are cemeteries, right? Not seminaries. Cemeteries. These is where ideas go to die in Christianity. And some of these folks are actually praising these individuals that are coming into church. All right, so surely these bad theologians, if they're on their side, they have to be wrong. This has to be serious. This has to be serious stuff. And watch out if you criticize or call them out for their anti-biblical stances. Some would say you're divisive, in sin, making ad hominem attacks and other concerning statements. In other words, if I call these people out, they're going to say that I'm the one being divisive and that I'm in sin and I'm making ad hominem attacks. Right? How dare we actually attack these people and call them out for who they are? But of course, Ken Ham is not afraid of these folks. And so he's willing to do it. He's willing to be, well, he doesn't think of himself as divisive or in sin or making ad hominem attacks, but he's the one that's going to call these folks out. And yet many would still say they agree with you. Right? Now, what are the many referring to? The many are referring to these apostate young earth creationists, right? These creationists that have gone astray, or at least are on the slippery slope, to becoming non-young earth creationists. And yet they still claim that they agree with you, that they are in union with you, that they are doctrinally compatible with you, and therefore they are like you. Ken Ham's going to say, you're not like us, right? You are wrong, right? And you need to be corrected. All right, continuing, and this still comes from the article. Welcome to what we claim has been happening within young earth creationism for the last 2 decades or more. So this isn't just something that just has come up recently. This is something that for 20 years has been percolating. And obviously at this point, it's percolated to the point where it's, we're ready to blow our top. We can't allow this to continue within our midst or it will destroy creationism. Learn more about this dangerous movement of young earth. Now here comes the label, young earth evolution, YEE. Right? So then you're supposed to click on the article and you'll go and read this first paragraph again and read and find out what's going on here. This is actually an introductory paragraph to what is supposed to now be a series of articles coming out once a week for the next couple of months. So 7 or 8 articles. Basically, I presume calling out individual young earth evolutionists and showing their doctrinal errors and their scientific errors. All right. So now in this, I'll say dramatic reading of a Ken Ham tweet. Okay. I don't have to dramatize it. This really is a very dramatic moment. But how important is it really? And how much is, I'm going to say he's overplaying his hand here, but we have to maybe understand why he's overplaying his hand. What is Ken Ham really afraid of? Is he truly afraid of doctrinal heresy creeping into young earth creationism? I don't think so. And we're not going to have enough time today to get into all the nuances of what I call the new creationists, because that's a group that I've talked about many times in the past. And identified in a way with my own sort of definition of that. And we're not going to get into all those details because this is going to be a continuing series, so we'll come back to some of those things. We're going to stick to this particular article and talk about like the big picture of like where does this come from and why is this like coming to the forefront right now at Answers in Genesis. So let's get started on that. So you go to the front page of Answers in Genesis. This is 2 weeks ago. And you'll find that there was this article. This is where I first saw it. What is it and why are we concerned? What is it referring to? What is it? It's referring to young earth evolution. Now, I think that any young earth creationist, devotee of Ken Ham, who comes to Answers in Genesis website, looking for the latest like news and thing that they want to read. And they're going to see on the front page, young earth evolution. And it's like, young earth evolution. Like we're opposed to evolution, but we're for young earth. How could there be such a thing as young earth evolution? That obviously sounds like an absolutely heretical idea, right? So, and look at the picture. Do you see the drawing? The drawing is of essentially a walking land animal that then is, let me get my pen out. Here's this walking land animal. And then you have this animal sort of adapted to living in water, and this actually is supposed to look a little like Accusations, which is considered the oldest whale-like fossil. And then you see this large fluke, and you see this large-bodied organism, which is obviously a whale. And so what is this image evoking? This image is evoking the idea that whales once lived on the land. And who believes that? All right. Evolutionists believe that, right? Or at least evolutionists have proposed, right? That's a hypothesis within evolutionary theory. Evolutionists would say that's a strongly supported hypothesis, that there was a walking animal that adapted to living in the water and has become the whales we have today. So now the implication here is that there are some young Earth creationists, except we're not going to call them creationists, we're going to call them young Earth evolutionists, who are suggesting that animals that lived on the land have adapted to living in the water. And every young Earth creationist knows that that is an evolutionary idea. And that is an anathema to young Earth creationism when God created the individual kinds, and whales are a kind, or maybe there's multiple kinds of whales, but we may mention that later. And so this particular, the way this is phrased, young Earth evolution, and showing this pathway of changes and adaptation, which would suggest to any follower of Ken Ham, all right, that this has to be wrong. This has to be an utterly wrong idea. And if there are individual creationists who believe this stuff, they must be eliminated, all right, from the creationist camp. They must be pushed out because they're a danger if they stay within. Right? That is the message that's coming across through the way that they have sculpted this narrative, right? And you saw the introduction that Ken Ham gave. All right, let's dig into this a little bit farther now. So here's the actual article. Should biblical creation become more like evolution? Of course, the answer is no, right? You know, anyone reading this article that is at all favorably minded toward answers in Genesis is going to be like, well, of course not, right? Right? This isn't really a question at all. This is meant to evoke a response, right? Oh, this is something horrible. Well, what's going on here? And that primes the person when they read the article to say, oh yeah, okay, we can't have, these people are believing in evolution, and we can't have that. All right, when the article was first released, it was put under the authorship of a Harry F. Sanders III. Harry F. Sanders III has written some 80 plus articles for the Answers in Genesis website. The thing you need to know about Harry Sanders, and I find interesting, and I will develop this idea a little bit today, but probably more in the future, is that Harry F. Sanders is a pseudonym. All right, it's not a person that anyone or any of us know who they are. And so there's no information on Answers in Genesis website about who Harry F. Sanders is. Right? Just a list of things that they've written for them. So we don't know what this person's expertise is. We don't know if they have a degree. We don't know if they have a degree in theology or in science. We know nothing about their ability to write this particular article or what their bias might be. That in itself is interesting because Answers in Genesis and Ken Ham is promoting this article as like a really important statement, right? From Answers in Genesis, warning followers to beware of these young Earth evolutionists. And they're putting that particular statement in the hands of an anonymous person. How convenient, right? Here's an anonymous person that's going to write this stuff for us. Warning us about these people. So it makes it very hard in a way to respond to this particular individual because you don't know how to respond to them not knowing who they are. But just in case I forget, although I shouldn't forget because I have a slide about it, but I'll just say it for now. Answers in Genesis has removed the authorship of this article. And they've created an editor's note a week after this was published that this was a mistake. That this article wasn't actually the work of a single person, but actually represents a position statement of Answers in Genesis. They've gone all in on this. This isn't just like, here's somebody's opinion that we're publishing, somebody who's writing for us, but saying that, but we can blame them if we get a lot of pushback. No, they're actually now claiming that the full emphasis of this article represents the official view of Answers in Genesis, which just means it's the official view of Ken Ham. All right, let's dig into it. You've already seen the first part of it here. Let's go down another paragraph below. So this is what comes after what Ken Ham had quoted in that tweet. I can certainly understand if the above paragraph shocks and disturbs you. All right, that first paragraph, especially the way I read it and kind of added in sort of the thinking behind what the average young Earth creationist would think when they're reading that particular article. That's what I'm trying to give you a feel for if you're not that young Earth creationist. So yes, I think it would be shocking. And it would sound very disturbing to be able to say that there are young Earth evolutionists that are within the midst of young Earth creationists that might be talking to your kids in Sunday schools and in church and maybe even preaching from the pulpit that are pretending to be young Earth creationists, saying that they're supportive of people like Ken Ham, and yet all the while they're slipping in this evil stuff. There is a group, all right, so he's identifying, he or she, Harry F. Sanders, there is a group within young Earth creationism that has subtly been trying to push models based on Genesis to be more like evolution in a number of ways. So they have models that are based on Genesis. They aren't necessarily the Genesis model, right? They're based on Genesis, and they're trying to tweak them to be more and more and more like evolution. Because of this high reliance on evolutionary ideas and presuppositions, nice catchwords young Earth creationists love to use, this group has been termed by some as young Earth evolutionists. Now, the reference there, I have a slide a little bit later here. The reference there is actually to an article by Institute for Creation Research from 2 years ago, in which I think it was Jake Hebert wrote an article about young Earth evolutionists and essentially warned the young Earth creationist community about these wolves in sheep's clothing that are within their midst, that are preaching and teaching a form of evolutionary biology or being influenced by evolutionary biology. And so Answers in Genesis is really just following up on this ICR article, but they have a lot more influence, right? I mean, Ken Ham has a much larger bullhorn than does a single writer at Institute for Creation Research. All right, so here we have it. This labeling of young Earth evolutionists. And now, J. Hebert didn't come up with that name. Actually, many others that are outside of young Earth creationism and have called them young Earth evolutionists or identified members within young Earth creationism, the young Earth evolutionist, and including me. But what I'm going to tell you right now, just because probably not going to listen to the whole video, right? I mean, I know the YouTube stats. You got to get all your important points in up early. I call all young Earth creationists of even Ken Ham's type young Earth evolutionists. Now, that would take a lot to unpack why, but we'll see how I don't think that there's really that big of a difference between Ken Ham and these new creationists or young Earth evolutionists. It's very curious, him calling out this young Earth evolutionism when Ken Ham is a young Earth evolutionist in the almost the same exact way that these individuals are young Earth evolutionists. All right, moving on. Damage control. Individuals involved in this loosely organized group include some professors at creation colleges. And this is, I've pointed this out as well. There's a number of individual faculty members at schools that are creationist, either creationist tending or creationist accepting or completely creationist affirming colleges. And those individuals teaching at those, they have maybe academic positions. And this is really kind of these words are a little bit of a scare tactic, right? It's almost like saying cemeteries, like seminaries, right? That seminaries are all bad because they've been influenced, and there's very few seminaries that are truly young Earth creationist oriented. It's just an extremely small number. And so seminaries are to be suspect. They've been infiltrated. And the fear of Ken Ham is that everything else is getting infiltrated, right? Christian schools are getting infiltrated. Christian colleges are infiltrated by these other ideas. So these individuals that are coming up with these ideas, where are they coming from? They're not necessarily coming from within the young earth organizations, apologetics ministries like Institute for Creation Research, Answers in Genesis, Creation Ministries International. But no, they're coming from either newly organized groups that are peripheral to those. So for example, like the New Creation blog. Or they're professors, individuals that have academic positions, and they write about young earth creationism, and they even publish in a variety of different young earth creationist journals. And so they have a different kind of influence. They're in schools and they're teaching students, right? And so they're teaching the next generation of academics, individuals with science degrees, a form of young earth creationism, at least a form that Ken Ham believes is really different. And he fears that they're the ones coming out of colleges or maybe going to graduate schools, and they're going to be the new wave or the new group of young earth creationism in the future. And that's one of the reasons I call them the new creationists. They are I think they are the future of creationism. This is where the future of where new creationists will come from. But for this particular author, this is kind of a warning. This is like saying they're really not under our control, right? They're not within Answers in Genesis, where we have a particular statement of faith where they have to abide by it, and they can't really think independently, right? Nobody in Answers in Genesis can truly have an independent thought in the sense of question anything, even if it's just. They're not saying I believe this must be true, but I've had thoughts about this, right? No, can't do that. But these faculty, especially, at colleges, faculty in faculty positions, that's their thing, is like, thinking outside the box and researching and thinking of new ideas. And new ideas can be very dangerous at times. And some of these people are dangerous. So we've got these professors at creationist colleges outside the thumb of Answers in Genesis. They can't directly influence them as they could their own employees. While these people may not be ill-intentioned, they might be, they're not purposely, like they may not be ill-intentioned, which just the way that's phrased, it sounds like they also might be ill-intentioned. This is just part and parcel for Harry F. Sanders articles. All right, I've read a ton of them on Answers in Genesis website, and although they're saying this is a statement that was not written by Harry F. Sanders now, clearly it was written by Harry F. Sanders. Now, it might have some light editing of that by other individuals to kind of sculpt it into like, okay, we're going to accept this as our statement. But a word analysis of this article and other Harry F. Sanders articles, I'm sure, would show that this is the way that Harry F. Sanders talks and thinks about things. And it's very similar to the mind of Ken Ham, which is why I think Ken Ham is attracted to and willing to allow this kind of language to go forward, because he thinks this way as well. They might not be ill-intentioned, but the result of their work, perhaps unwittingly for some, right? Some of them don't really know the danger they're putting other young earth creationists in. They don't realize that they're spewing some ideas that may be leading people astray. Has been moving the church toward evolutionary ideas that are incompatible with Scripture. In other words, this author, Answers in Genesis, is laying the blame for the church moving toward evolutionary ideas being incompatible with Scripture on actual young earth creationists, right? Who may be wittingly or unwittingly, maybe ill-intentioned or maybe ill-intentioned and purposely doing this within, and laying this groundwork of undermining, right? The, what does Ken Ham always say, right? The authority of Scripture. This adoption of a number of evolutionary ideas, like linking birds with dinosaurs, for example. Okay, now we come to the first point where I say, this really isn't. These young earth evolutionists are not really any different than any other creationists with respect to their basic assumptions, for their basic doctrines, their statement of faith, what they believe in, what they want from young earth creationism, I don't see that many differences there, right? The differences I see them in is, now let's not go down that road. I've got other videos and other things that talk about what I think are the distinctives of some individuals within creationism. But let's just take a look at the next line, because that's, there was a reason I stopped there. Like linking birds with dinosaurs, for example. These individuals like Kurt Wise and Todd Wood, right, so forth, they're not linking dinosaurs with birds in the sense that they believe that dinosaurs evolved into birds. Now, the way this person is writing this, they're leading very much giving the perception to a reader that this is what the young earth evolutionists are doing. Right? I think it's very unfair to characterize it this way. What have some of those young earth evolutionists done? They've said, you know what, Answers in Genesis just published an article just not too long ago by their new paleontologist, railing about the fact that the young earth creationists are falling into this trap of calling some dinosaurs that have feathers, some fossils that have feathers, they're calling them dinosaurs. How could they possibly do that? They can't be. They're separately created. All the young earth evolutionists, I don't even want to call them that. All right, I'm going to call them the new creationists. Because the young earth evolutionist is a pejorative term, even though I've used it before in the past, and I think it's an accurate way of saying it. Remember, I'm referring really to all young earth creationists this way, almost all this way, not just to this particular group. So I'm going to call them the new creationist as my distinctive that defines the group that they're talking about here. Okay, so back to the birds and dinosaurs. What the new creationists are saying is that they're acknowledging, you look at those fossils and they have dinosaur-like characteristics and they have bird-like characteristics. They're not clearly birds, and they're not clearly just like some other kind of dinosaur. They're willing to say what is really obvious and a no-brainer, and that is God made a kind of organism that has dinosaur-like features and some bird-like features. And that's a unique creation. There's nothing heretical about that at all. They're not connecting the two via some kind of evolutionary assumptions. This is just a ridiculous idea. And to use, and look at this. This is the example this author is using. This article is using this as an example. They're adopting evolutionary ideas like linking birds with dinosaurs, and then making improper biblical and having improper biblical and scientific discernment. It's a big problem for the church. Now, the whole improper biblical discernment, I'm not really seeing that either in their works. Despite, we'll see. They're going to have a bunch of articles. The second one's already out, and it tries to make some case that Todd Wood, it's about Todd Wood in particular, a young earth creationist outside the main organizations, who is one of the more influential, well-known young earth creationists outside of those organizations, and trying to make the connection with him and some bad theology. They just don't understand. Todd, sure, he may have some differences, some slight differences in interpretation. I don't think it rises nearly to the drama that's here. But let's save that for another time. We're going to save that article for another time. Okay, now this gets even better. If better means worse, then it gets better. The average man in the pew hearing these words said by someone who calls himself a creationist. Well, what words are those? I guess those are the words of things like linking birds and dinosaurs, which I think is just a false sentiment here. Or some kind of improper biblical or scientific discernment, some kind of acknowledgement that evolutionary biology might have some good evidence for this or that, and we should consider these things and try to understand them within a young earth creation perspective. I'm not exactly sure what's being referred to, but The average man in the pew hearing these words said by someone who calls himself a creationist, because of course they're not actually creationists, they just call themselves a creationist, assumes they must be true. Well, this sentence has a lot in it. Let's think about a couple things that are in this sentence. The average man in the pew. Do you notice the subtle sexism here? It's not the average person in the pew or the average man or woman in the pew. It's the average man in the pew, because it's the man in the pew that is the only one that matters, right, in the church, right? It's like he's the one that hears the real word, and he's the one that's going to instruct his wife or so-and-so. I might be pushing that a little bit far in terms of what this author is actually thinking there. But I think what it is this author's not actually thinking about what they're saying. It's like their inner bias actually coming out, right? Just they don't realize what they're saying. This is just the way they talk. It's all about men. The average man in the pew, hearing these words said by someone who calls himself a creationist, now here's the best part, assumes they must be true. Right? See, if you're a creationist, if you're a follower of Ken Ham, if somebody comes to your church and says that they believe young earth creation is just like Ken Ham does, and they talk to you about whatever, it could be the biblical interpretation, it could be interpretation of the fossil record, right? It could be interpretation of the solar system. But whatever they talk about, the man in the pew assumes they must be true. It assumes they must be right. Right? You get that? Ken Ham answers in Genesis is the bearer of all truths. And so if anyone listens to anything they say, the person in the pew in a correct church, a biblical church, right, that hasn't been corrupted, will automatically assume that what they're saying is true. Now, here's exactly why they're so upset. Here's why Ken Ham's so upset. These people, in their minds, are coming into the church and saying things under the guise of being young earth creationists, and saying they have all the same doctrinal views and they uphold they have the same assumptions, the same basic views of the origins of the earth, the age of the earth, Noah's flood, all right? All the standard things. They're saying, we have all these particular views. And of course, the man in the pew then assumes everything they must say is true. But now they're going to argue, but not everything they say is actually true. And here people are actually believing it. And so therefore they're believing lies. And this cannot stand. I mean, this is why, Ken Ham is upset. This is undermining the truth. Weighing these views against Scripture ultimately creates cognitive dissonance that can lead, and we have testimony that it has led, to someone abandoning the faith. Right? So these individuals are saying one thing, we're saying something else, and when people start to really think about things and connect some dots, they start like, wait a second, you're saying one thing, but you're saying another. You're saying like this could have, these mechanisms could have been involved in making these species, where you're saying those mechanisms can't and can't do this. And so you're all talking at odds with each other. And therefore, that makes me question creationism, creates cognitive dissonance, right? I'm confused. And therefore, I might abandon the faith. Right? Now, we could go on for a half hour just about this particular concept. There's tons of interesting things to say. I'm going to skip this and maybe talk about that another time, because I don't want this to be really long today. We'll have plenty of time to continue to peruse these things. Oh, so the second article is out. This is the tagline for the second article, which just came out a couple days ago. A professing young earth creationist. Again, you see the words there? A professing young earth creationist. And that's almost kind of a sarcastic line, because he's like saying, well, they're professing to be young earth creationists, but I don't really believe they are. Should be the last person to call into question the historical objective nature of Christianity. However, Todd Wood does this in his book. I don't think this author really understands what Todd Wood is saying in The Quest, but we'll get to that at another time. What I wanted to show this slide for is to show you that the editor's note This article was mistakenly attributed to a single author. For a week, this very controversial, article is on their website, and it has an attribution of authorship to this anonymous Harry F. Sanders III. Upon initial publication. It is, however, a ministry statement and not the work of a single individual. Well, yeah, anyone who writes an article on Answers in Genesis, it's not just going to go straight to the site without editing, right? There's going to be editors. There's going to be somebody who's looked at it, make sure it fits their particular views and guidelines. It has to say certain things in certain ways. So it's never actually the work of a single individual. However, most of this article, I'm sure, is Harry F. Sanders. And they're also reminding you, as will the entire series. All right, now the second article's out. To me, the second article reads like a Harry F. Sanders article as well. Very much so. All right. And so I think it's like that's the first draft. Whoever this Harry F. Sanders is, they're writing the first drafts of these things as the statements for Answers in Genesis. We apologize for any confusion this may have caused. Interesting that they have made this note, but I guess it was already well known that Harry F. Sanders had been attributed to this thing, and they had to kind of explain that. Now, under Ken Ham's Facebook post, actually, I guess that wasn't a tweet, that was a Facebook post that originally posted. Under his Facebook post, there was a whole bunch of comments about this, and I just picked out, took a couple screenshots of some comments. I'm very happy that I'm in my new church that believes in a young earth, Calvary Chapel. Exactly what happens in the schools of America. Absolutely not. There is no evolution, just God's creation. Very important to know what's happening in our churches in regards to this topic. Thank you for posting it. Absolutely not. AIG is one of the few voices promoting the truth of a literal biblical creation. We must stand on the Word of God. Adaptation is not evolution. Most of these comments, evolution is men's theory with a lot of holes in it. God's word is fact. How can you mix the two together? See, there's somebody who saw the title right on the front page of Answers in Genesis, Young Earth Evolutionist. How can those two be mixed together? These people must be evil. They have to be absolutely wrong. I've been told that the word evolution is evolution. And so you're saying that there are young earth evolutionists within the camp. How could that be? Right? Absolutely not. They will divide the church. Not good at all. No, can't have that. This has been happening for years in most of our churches. It's why people are so quick to deny the literal creation count. People aren't dumb. They see the church capitulating and changing to reduce controversy. So they're following the very ideologies that the church claims to hate. Because why not? If the church is, they might as well. See, and this just goes on and on and on. And what are all these comments? What do they all represent? They represent exactly what this author and Ken Ham wants them to think. All right? It's like they know their audience. They've used the keywords to sour and to sour them on these other young earth creationists. Because they are young earth creationists. No doubt in my mind. They're absolutely young earth creationists. Right? Ken Ham is willing to cannibalize young earth creationism in order to get out what he perceives as, a cancer within. But what he's really doing, right, is he's stamping out any kind of self-reflection within young earth creationism. One of the things I think that really gets to Ken Ham, and I think gets to this particular author, Harry F. Sanders, is that these young earth evolutionists, I'll say the new creationists, are willing to call out errors within, most specifically scientific errors, bad arguments that young earth creationists make. Ken Ham makes a lot of bad arguments, but they can continue to persist because if you call them out on those, you're being divisive. You're not playing the game. You're not following, you get called, you're being bullied. It's like certain politicians who just start calling you names, right? As a way, it's not really a defense. It's a way to get your followers to think ill of certain individuals. It's a real Christian way to go about it, right? in this case, what Accusations and Genesis is doing, what these creationists are doing, is they are eliminating the ability for themselves to adapt, to be able to have self-reflection, to be able to have those within ask important questions and self-correct within. It's like peer review. It's kind of like saying we don't even want any peer reviewers at all within the church or within creationism. And so by kicking them out, all right, it does purify the element, assuming that what's left is pure. But if what's left is not pure, and I don't think it's far from it, it has no way of actually self-correcting anymore, because those are outsiders now, right? You've made them in the eyes of these folks right here, these people who are making comment. If they read the article, they would say the same thing. But if they actually knew the works and words of those other new creationists, I think they would understand that this is an overreach. This article is meant to cast poor light on other individuals in order to downplay their influence. See, these are people outside of Ken Ham's direct control, although they're not outside of his control altogether, because he commands a large audience and he can cause people outside in those in those creation colleges. He can cause people who are other young earth creationists, all these new creationists who are trying to gather a following themselves or get published in their particular journals. He can get them basically blacklisted this way. And so you end up with a situation where this is about control. It's about control, and I think it's really a lot about personality conflicts. All right, it's about the future of young earth creationism as well. Right, Ken Ham, young earth creationist organizations are so canalized, they become so streamlined in a sense and into one particular set of views that they're not very nimble with respect to change, and they've also grown, Accusations and Genesis has gotten very, very bloated, and so they really need continued support, in order to continue their ministry. And they see these other things as threats to that. And I do see them as threats. I really do. In my mind, they're good threats, all right? They're doing some good for young earth creationism. Now, I know some of them might not like to hear me say that, because even in this article, by the way, I'm mentioned in this particular article. I don't care to talk about that part. It's not a big deal to me. But in general, I'm mentioned as somebody who has praised, right, some of the new creationists for some of the means by which they go about talking about creationism, the way that they deal with people, right, their particular attitudes, right, their personalities, and their ability to, I'll say, develop some cogent arguments and to have reasonable debate. And so, unfortunately, that means that somebody who's outside of creationism looks like I'm playing favorites to some. And since I'm outside of creationism and I'm supportive, and I am sort of supportive in that way, since I'm supportive of some, that's being used against them. Right? Oh, look, here's this individual actually saying that Toddwood's doing a good thing. Right? He's saying he's being a reasonable person with this particular evidence. And he's right in calling out young earth creationists for making certain kinds of errors. By the way, this is the article that by Jake Hubert in 2020, Is Creation Evidence Ambiguous? And this seems to be the article that kind of has spurred the second article by Harry F. Sanders at Accusations and Genesis, which I'm not going to go over today. And in this article, he goes after what he calls the young earth evolutionist. And he places the blame on the philosophy called Fideism, claiming that God purposely made both his existence and the truth of creation faith uncertain to mankind. So he claims that Toddwood, Wise, and some of these others, the new creationists, are Fideistic in their views. And this is where I think that Harry F. Sanders and Ken Ham are coming along and going to try to make the claim that They're theologically unsound. And therefore, that's another reason that we should not be allowing them in our midst or letting them influence your children or so. Again, I'm not going to go through this whole argument, but I'm going to say that I think they've far exceeded, they've far overreached in terms of the blame and creating divisions. I mean, they're making divisions within young Earth creationism in what they're doing here. They are taking small differences, right, within a Christian community among brothers who have the same goals and the same root understanding of young Earth, of a young Earth. And they're trying to create divisions within that. It's just ridiculous. It really is cannibalism within young Earth creationism. All right, so here's the second article. Christianity, a subjective experience. And so again, that kind of follows up on that particular article, but it specifically addresses Todd Wood. And so I said we wouldn't get into that today, but I want to end here, I have one more slide, but I want to say one other thing, and that is I just watched a Paul Garner and Todd Wood Let's Talk Creation episode earlier today, or maybe it was yesterday, maybe it was last evening. And it's a really great episode. All right. Todd Wood and Paul Garner have this Let's Talk Creation podcast and YouTube channel. And they talk about all kinds of issues within young Earth creationism. They're refreshingly open about where young Earth creationists don't have answers. And they hope and want to be involved in providing those answers. But they admit where they don't have answers. In this particular episode, talking about humans walking with dinosaurs, they're actually talking about the Pluxee track site, and they're talking about the fraud, at that particular site and the history. Really, Paul Garner provides a really fascinating history here, lesson on how this particular site with presumed human and dinosaur footprints became so popular in the, 50s and 60s. And it was actually called out within the young Earth creationist community. He has the articles that were written that came and examined some of those fossils and claims that they were fossil foots and showed very reasonable evidence that they were fakes. And yet the creationist community didn't take up that information, and they continued to promote this particular site. And it ended up becoming a huge deal because so many people believed that this was really great evidence that humans and dinosaurs once lived together and walked together at this particular location. And there are still people that believe that today. Now, eventually what happens is there's a whole bunch of non-young Earth creationists that come along, do a bunch of investigations, and eventually even Institutes for Creation Research has to begrudgingly admit that it looks like the human footprints at this site are not, in fact, genuine human footprints, and that some of them were truly faked fossils. And that's a blemish on young Earth creationism, that they were not able to self-correct themselves with their own experts within their own community, and had to be forced to admit error from outside. And so I see this as, it was interesting watching this today, because I see this is very similar to what some of the new creationists, what their important role is within young Earth creationists, in terms of being frank with the evidence, willing to test the evidence, test the hypotheses that young Earth creationists are generating and say, this is a lousy hypothesis, and then come up with potentially better hypothesis. These individuals have not abandoned young Earth creationism by any means. They are open to finding solutions. And if some of those solutions, I understand Ken Ham might find to be outside of what he finds to be acceptable solutions. But you need to have a conversation about it. I find this, you see the subtitle here? Or the subtitles here. I just did a screen capture. I didn't even know I captured this particular subtitle at this moment in the talk. It's near the end. But we need good criticism and review. I think that's Paul Garner actually mentioning here that within the creationist community, we need good criticism. And the good criticism is the best criticism is criticism within the community, not from outside the community. It's not from me, it's from individuals within the community that will make the biggest difference and is the biggest self-correcting mechanism they could have. All right, so here are two individuals that are being talked about as if they're young Earth evolutionists in the pejorative sense, as if they should be outcast. They should be labeled as a danger to the young Earth creationist community. And I think that's really pathetic. It just is. It's really pathetic and sad that Ken Ham would would go to this particular route, all right, to try to fix young Earth creationism as if it needed fixing. Again, I think it's a lot of fear on his part. Okay, I need to wrap this up, but I have one other thing that I don't think I've stressed enough here. Harry F. Sanders, Answers in Genesis. They're pointing to things like, they're calling them young Earth evolutionists. And I made this statement before that I said, I think of all young Earth creationists, at least Answers in Genesis, maybe a little less so Institute for Creation Research, but nonetheless, I really would put them all in the camp of being evolutionist in having evolutionary biology be highly influential on many young Earth creationists. And it's not just this small group at all. It's Ken Ham. He might wish to disagree about the breadth of what constitutes a kind. But you have to remember, Ken Ham has this Ark Encounter. And on the Ark Encounter, he has had individuals write for his organization all the things that they think are kinds, the kinds that God made originally. And among those kinds, he has he has articles on his website that suggest that possibly all the bats are one kind. Now, they actually separate them into, I think it's 10 to 15 different bat kinds as separate kinds of different kinds of bats. But there is the hint, the suggestion that possibly all the bats are one kind. Now, let's go back to the whale thing, right? He's showing a picture of whales coming from land into the sea. And you know why he's showing that? It's because of the instant rejection that will come from his audience of that particular view. But Kurt Wise has proposed that as a possibility. I think of it more as a thought exercise, as like he's thinking about, is that a possibility that could be within a kind, that there could have been an animal kind on the ark, and after that it had built into it the ability to adapt to water. Like maybe it was a kind that lived on land, but it was already well adapted to being in the water a lot, like a weasel, right? But God installed in that organism the genetic capacity to further adapt and become the different kinds of cetaceans in the time after the ark. Now, that sounds wild and crazy, as from a old Earth perspective, right? From the world being millions of years old, for that to happen within 4,000 years sounds absolutely insane. There doesn't seem to be any genetic way to explain that and so forth, all right? So, and I think Ken Ham looks at that and goes like, that's impossible, right? That can't happen. That's too much divergence. That's too much adaptation. Couldn't have happened. And therefore, they are succumbing to the evolutionary hypothesis and the evidence that evolutionists have come up with, because there's lots of different forms of evidence that suggest that whales today have land animal ancestors. And they're saying, you're being influenced by evolutionary biology, and you're willing to start to think about them actually having been lived on land. And the only reason you're thinking that is because you're under the influence of evolutionary biology. Well, I'm sorry, but Ken Ham, you're under the influence of evolutionary biology. I've heard you say that all the different canines, including all the different kinds of foxes, wolves and coyotes and African wild dogs, all are the same kind, and they came from two individuals. Guess what? That is about as crazy of an idea as walking whales. That's an enormous amount of genetic difference, and it's an enormous amount of morphological difference. You have a display, Ken Ham, at the Creation Museum that shows two primates getting off the ark and becoming orangutans, chimpanzees, and apes. Three very different sorts of organisms with three very different genomes and all the other different fossil great apes. And you have a picture of that happening all just in the last 4,000 years ago. You're no different than Todd Wood and Kurt Wise. Right? In my eyes, there's no difference there at all. You have succumbed to an evolutionary assumption. You would not have thought that those are related to each other if evolutionary biology had never existed. You have taken the secular understanding of the similarities between those organisms, genetic and morphological, and assumed that they share those things because they share a common ancestor. You only got those ideas from evolutionary biology. You are a young Earth evolutionist. In the same way that you are describing this heretical view coming out of young Earth creationism. I don't see the difference between them. Now, maybe in your 6 or 7 articles you got coming up, you'll be able to refine and explicate exactly how these are significant differences between young Earth evolutionists and not. But so far, I'm not seeing it. I just don't see it. They're in the same camp. They have some, yes, they have a different hypothesis. That's a different hypothesis. You don't think that whales walked. Somebody else thinks they could have. And by the way, I don't think Kurt Wise is saying he absolutely says that they did. He's just willing to explore that idea, just like you have members at your organization that are willing to explore the idea that like all ungulates might all be related to one another. That's a massive amount of diversity. That all the different canines are related to one another. All the bats might actually be related to another. You have some massive kinds that include an incredible amount of genetic diversity and divergence. You're not pushing they're not pushing the boundaries of how much change can happen over time any farther than you have been willing to push it yourself. So I think it's really disingenuous to say that somehow you're not an evolutionist, and you're not influenced by evolution. Like, we're not influenced by evolution. It's just the Bible, and we then start there as if they're not starting with that same presupposition too. This is the thing that I think bothers me the most, and I do feel really bad for these young Earth evolutionists being castigated for being the same thing as you, which is why I think this isn't about scientific disagreement. It's not about you have a different hypothesis for how to explain this particular data. All right. We agree on the same basic assumptions of the age of the earth, and God created all different kinds, and there are kinds. We just have a different understanding of what that kind is exactly. That's not the reason. That is not a reason to be going separate ways or to forcing somebody out of communion with you. That's not what this is about. I don't think that's what it's really about. I think there's something much more here that's bothering Ken Ham and his organization. And I think part of it has to do with trepidation about the future, about the style and form of apologetic, the way they argue for their case, the way they talk to individuals, the way they correspond and interact and are actually allow themselves to talk to other non-young Earth creationists and treat them with some kind of respect. That seems very offensive to you because you feel like that's somehow bringing people in. So you don't allow your people really to go out and to talk to the world, which is why they're so illiterate in so many ways. This is why they don't have an understanding. And this is why they are unable to accommodate new data and to come up with new ideas that actually might advance young earth creationism as a better, more robust explanation for the diversity of life on earth. Now, I'm skeptical that you'll ever come up with an actual robust explanation, but I absolutely do believe that Todd Wood and Kurt Wise and the many others, if you go to my website, I have a list of ones that I think that you're talking about here. Those individuals absolutely do believe the world is yam, that God created separate kinds, right? And that Noah's flood is real, right? And that the plan of salvation is exactly what you believe the plan of salvation is. They agree with you in principle on all the main things. And you're going to nitpick and find a few non-main minor things that aren't plain in Scripture. And you're going to try to create a wedge. You're kind of trying to separate them. And I think that's very unfortunate. And it's very sad. And I know that there are some that are probably like, yay, this is great. This is dividing and separating young earth creationism, and it's going to hurt young earth creationism. And that's a good thing. And that's not me. I have many young earth creationist brothers, friends, family, people I care about who are really hurt by these types of things. And I would like to see them led out of young earth creationism to a more robust understanding in theology. But this is not the way to do it. This is not the way I want them to do that, is to create this kind of cognitive distance, because you're the one creating cognitive distance now. Because, yes, you are actually manufacturing differences within the young earth creationist community and forcing individuals to choose. And I don't like the methods. As we saw just in your introduction, just the way that you prime your audience to reject these individuals is, this is not the way to go about doing things. And like I said, you can say, well, if you criticize them about their anti-biblical stances, I don't think they're anti-biblical stances, and that's part of the problem that you have. Then they're going to say that you're divisive, or that you're in sin, or making ad hominem attacks. Unfortunately, you put us in the position of having to say those things, that you're divisive, that you're in sin, and that you're making ad hominem attacks. This article is not written out of love. Now, you might say this is some kind of like harsh, not harsh. You might be saying this is some kind of like tough love, right? This is what has to be done in order to keep the church pure. But looking from the outside and knowing even many people within young earth creationism, you aren't without sin, and there is always going to be diversity, always going to be diversity of thought. Like, just think about any church. If every person was a clone of each other with exact thoughts, I guess that's the only way you could possibly have a church that didn't have some diversity of thinking. And of course, we want to put guardrails in terms of like basic doctrines that we need to hold and we have to hold in order to call ourselves Christians and call ourselves members of a particular denomination or church. Totally understand that. But your walls and your divisions are more restrictive than certainly I think you can get from the Bible. All right, let's call it quits there for today. Like I said, this is probably going to continue. These are just my first thoughts, my first reflections on this particular article. Let's give it a couple weeks. See a couple articles come out, and let's see what kind of direction things are going. Maybe as I read these articles, I will start to see that they've actually identified a real wedge, a real difference, a real theological important distinction. And if that's so, I will find that interesting and I'll acknowledge that. But to this point, this particular first article is completely unconvincing with respect to making some grand point about how these individuals are a terrible danger to young earth creationism. All right, thanks for listening. Take care of yourself out there. We'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.